the idea of satisfying people's preferences got morphed into growing as much as we could. And that had to do with, the conditions of the post-World War II era. Mm-hmm. But it's always important to remember what the model says. Economists got amnesia about shorter hours of work.
Hello and welcome to our third episode of the Drayton Discourse for the year 2021, proudly brought to you by the Consumerism Society at University College London.
Today we're delighted to host Professor Juliet Schor, an economist and professor of sociology at Boston College.
Professor Schor's research interests cover consumer society and consumer culture, working hours and lifestyle, environmental degradation, and the new sharing or gig economy.
She has authored numerous books, including The Overworked American, a national bestseller which has heavily influenced debate on work and family, topics which have again risen to prominence in light of the pandemic and work-from-home model.
Let's proceed to the interview. Thank you, Professor Schor, for joining us for this interview. Our first question relates to your personal career. You pursued your higher education in economics and even started your teaching career in the discipline. What inspired you to switch to sociology, and what lens does it provide you that economics doesn't?
Yeah, that's a great question. I wrote a book on working hours that came out in the early 90s called The Overworked American, The Unexpected Decline of Leisure. And there was a chapter in there called the Insidious Cycle of Work and Spend. And I gave a lot of talks on that book. And at one of them, someone in the audience asked me, how do you get out of the cycle of work and spend? And I thought I understood the work side, but I really wasn't sure about the spending side. And I started thinking a lot more about that. And my next project was on sort of social pressures to spend. And it resulted in a book called The Overspent American. But in the process of writing that book, I realized that economists had sort of stopped thinking about social dynamics with respect to consumption. It was a consequence of the way post-World War II economics developed, with a much more individualist model and assumptions of no interpersonal utility comparison. So in my view, like, the most important dynamics of consumption were kind of ruled out by assumption. And so I gravitated to other disciplines where there was actually a kind of renaissance in what came to be called consumption studies, but anthropology, geography, history, all of which were experiencing booms in studies of consumption, as well as sociology. And sociology was the place where I found sort of the most work that was relevant for me, in particular the work of Pierre Bourdieu. So that was kind of how it happened. I just sort of followed my interests, and I think of it as sort of, I just started walking, and then one day I woke up and found I was a sociologist. But, I have continued to work on various more economic topics since then. I sort of went back to, I have been studying labor issues for quite a while now. So yes, but in 2001, I moved institutions and went into a sociology department.
Now, moving towards the platform or gig economy, something that you have extensively studied and researched about, and one that has also gained a lot of prominence over the pandemic period. The first question is the nature of the harms of platform monopolies like Amazon different from that of conventional monopolies? In particular, does the data ownership by these platforms pose a threat of surveillance and market exploitation?
Yes, and I think, to a certain extent, you've answered the question very well in posing it, which is these companies are different than sort of classical monopolies. In the classical case, we have surplus extraction via market power sort of across all consumers in a sort of generic and pretty much, relatively common way. The company sets a price that's higher than it would be in the competitive equilibrium. With the platform companies and their ability to extract data, you have a number of things going on. One is surveillance, which you've mentioned, and there's been work in the gig labor space on, say, ride-hail drivers, for example, and the kinds of surveillance that the apps are able to do on the drivers. So that's one thing well known. That surveillance actually allows the company to control the workers in numerous ways. One is just through, knowing whether they're following the platform's policies, but the other is that data extraction that you've mentioned allows a number of things. It allows gamification. It allows personalized pricing from the point of view of the platform. It allows them to blind take away information from the driver or the consumer. So you have, in a way that the issues are very similar also between earners and consumers. So with consumers, you also have things like personalized pricing. So Uber knows your habits, and it knows, when you really need to go somewhere or when you're willing to pay and when you aren't. But it has a lot of other ways of getting information. For example, they said they didn't use it. I don't know, this was some years ago. It was reported they bought a company that had a patent that would allow them to know when your cell phone battery was low. When your battery is low, presumably you're willing to spend more because you're more anxious about getting home. Or when you're drunk. It has a way of knowing when you're drunk, and it knows it can charge you more. So it can learn all your personal foibles, your own particular things, the particular states you're in, and take advantage of them. And lawyers have written about this, but it's a kind of predatory dimension of platform power that goes beyond what a classic monopoly has, and really cries out for regulation. These companies should not be allowed to have this kind of power in the market, because it creates a very, very unfair advantage in their favor.
That does sound scary, doesn't it? Yes, but so the onset of platforms has enabled a proliferation of production and consumption, leading into a heavier impact on the environment and the society. For instance, a surge in ride-hailing services is directly linked to traffic congestion and air pollution, while property rental services like Airbnb have been held responsible for uprooting communities and neighborhoods. So, but could the platform economy be reconciled with sustainability?
So this is a really important question, and one on which we have much less research and kind of data than we do on many of either the kinds of questions around monopoly or labor, or even some of the consumer questions. The first thing I would say is that so far, if you take the platform economy as a whole, we would have to say its impact on the environment and on climate in particular has been very, very negative. So it has led to major increases in carbon pollution. Now, why? Well, the biggest reason, perhaps accidental, is that the largest platforms are in transportation and travel, both of which are highly intensive, carbon-intensive activities. So if we think about what these platforms did when they came in, they offered new services, they offered new, different ways, some new ways of accessing these services for the consumer, but they also dramatically lowered prices. So in the early days of ride hail, it was, a half to a third of what a taxi cab would cost. There were periods when you could get a shared ride hail in the United States for about the price of public transportation. You could get a $3 ride hail. And Airbnb offered much cheaper alternatives than hotels. So no surprise, you offer people a cheaper alternative and also a good with convenience and other very positive features on the quality side, you get a big expansion of demand. So that's the really negative part of it. Now, it's very hard to reconcile cheap, more convenient services in travel and transport with a sustainability agenda. It's pretty much at this point impossible until we've totally decarbonized those activities, which is going to be a while. So, and we don't even yet know the full extent of it. I have a project I'm working on now, which is the carbon footprint of Airbnb, but we're just looking within cities. We don't yet have a way to measure what we call induced travel, like how much more are people traveling because Airbnbs are available. We're pretty sure it is. There's survey data suggesting that, but it's a hard thing to figure out. There are platforms that can reduce ecological and carbon footprints. So for example, Craigslist, there's been some work on that by Anders Fremstad showing that it does reduce municipal waste in areas as it comes in. And Free Cycle, probably, the donation platforms for used goods probably have some beneficial impact, although we're not sure how much. One of my students is studying what are called buy nothing groups, and they're basically Free Cycle's free groups where people give and receive used items. They don't seem to have a big impact on how much new purchasing people do. So I think one of the areas where you probably have the biggest positive impact is on food sharing. So platforms that reduce food waste. You're in the United Kingdom, there's a platform called Olio that I'm studying at the moment with some Israeli collaborators who are the earliest researchers, Tamar Makoff, to study this, and she and her colleagues did a really sophisticated study of the carbon impacts of food sharing and found they were quite positive. Most of it, they take surplus food, they keep it out of the landfills so you don't get that big methane emissions from it. Mostly the food was being transported through low carbon means, walking, cycling, public transportation. So there wasn't a lot of driving. That's in London. On the other hand, we haven't measured the rebound effects yet. If people get free food, what are they doing with the money that they save? There's some studies of rebound effects on Airbnb. People are earning all that money. I mean, that's a whole other thing. So I think it's really hard. There are some other ways to do it. You've got to build the incentives in to reduce the carbon footprint. So Lyft has been doing carbon offsetting. It's better than nothing. As we know, carbon offsetting doesn't really do too much. There is true ride sharing. And for example, BlaBlaCar, a European company where people take rides with people who are already going somewhere. Unlike ride hail, which created new driving. But I mean, the key is really to not increase the activity. And I think for that, it's mostly the free platforms that will work. I mean, once you monetize these things and give people incentives to earn money, they tend to increase activity a lot. There are some last mile solutions with mobility platforms for public transportation to get that, to and from the station. That could be increased public transport use, although so far ride hail really looks to have reduced public transport. It positioned itself as an alternative. And then the final one is, if Airbnb weren't cheaper, it probably does reduce carbon footprints to have people staying in homes rather than hotels. Airbnb has made a lot of this. They've done a big study on it. I think they've probably overstated it for various reasons, but that's a possibility. I think the bottom line is without a really strong regulatory framework that really puts a big cost onto the use of carbon, the platform economy will end up being carbon enhancing rather than reducing.
Moving on to a section on consumerism. So one of your main ideas is that by decreasing our working hours, we would subsequently decrease our levels of consumption, which would alleviate our ecological footprint and increase our levels of well-being through increased leisure, more family time, etc., all while maintaining the current standards of living we have. So it's just reforming this productivity dividend. So we have two questions on this matter. The first one is, couldn't a reduction in consumption levels lead to insufficient aggregate demand in the economy, causing firms to lower prices and possibly triggering a deflationary spiral that would ultimately reduce employment levels?
So you gave me two different assumptions in the question. On the first one, you said, we're going to maintain the standard of living and we're just going to use our productivity dividend to get more leisure, which is basically what I've advocated for a very long time.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I've understood from your work. And then wouldn't a deflationary spiral?
Reduction in consumption levels implies trading off income for time, right?
Yes.
The first part of the question. So what I would say is this: yes, a reduction in if you reduce consumption, you reduce aggregate. You will do it through a reduction in aggregate demand, almost by definition, right? Mm-hmm. Whether I think the bigger impact than reductions in prices is probably going to be reductions in employment. Leading to a downward spiral in output rather than prices. I mean, you may get some deflationary pressures, but there's asymmetry in the system with respect to inflation and deflation. So prices don't, a lot of prices, for reasons that we talked about earlier, monopoly, don't necessarily
reflect,
move perfectly with supply and demand. But the thing, if you think about, I think to get to, I think where the heart of your question is sort of, is there a path of hours reductions that can avoid this kind of downward spiral, unemployment, possibly deflation, and so forth? Excuse me. And the answer is yes. There are sort of two ways to think about it. One is, if you just do what I started with, which is you're at a given level of employment, it has a certain level of output that goes along with it. You have a productivity increase, you just take it all in the form of shorter hours of work. So your output remains the same, your demand remains the same, your employment remains the same. Everything pretty much remains the same, except people have a bit more free time. Now, there are some other things that will change, some changes in the composition of demand, most likely as people adjust, based on their time and money budgets. But you're not going to be expecting like a big aggregate demand negative shock from that. There's another way it can happen, which is through a process that I've also studied called downshifting, where people make voluntary reductions in their labor supply. So that's another way you can end up with fewer working hours and also get those carbon benefits. And there you have the simultaneously you are pulling out labor supply and then also the product demand to match it, because if people are working less and earning less, they're demanding less in the way of consumption goods. So it actually could be a smooth transition, as long as, particularly if it's sort of somewhat gradual. So over time, you find more and more people want to work fewer hours. They withdraw their labor from the labor market. There's less production demand. There's less demand for consumption, but there's less reason for the firms to produce, because they'll just produce to that demand. And employment should be fine because it's all a voluntary reduction. So you'll get an equilibrium again in the labor market. So that's another way you can think about this happening, a kind of gradual downshifting. And we have countries where we've seen that happen, where sort of Northern European countries, where over time the amount of hours either in a year or the number of years that people want to work have gradually declined.
And don't you think that if we use our productivity dividend to remaining on the same level of output but reducing employment, wouldn't there be a problem if, let's say, population growth is so strong that it would kind of counterbalance this, and then that we could have a decrease?
Yeah, so this is all with a stable population.
Okay.
So if you have a growing population or a shrinking population, you would just need to adjust for that. But you can just think of everything on a population basis. But your second question, I think, is the more challenging one. So maybe we should move on to that one.
Sure. So to what extent, in your opinion, is demand linked to technological innovation? And don't you think there is a trade-off between short-term immediate cuts to our ecological footprint by utilizing our existing productivity dividend in reducing our working hours of consumption, and rather hoping that through steady consumer demand that in the future we'll have better innovation, which will ultimately, in the long run, end up reducing our ecological footprint even more, which is pretty much a variant of the Kuznets curve, the question.
Yeah, so this is, I think although economists understand technological change better today than they did, when I wrote my book, say in the early 1990s, it's an issue, it's a dynamic that I think is not all that well understood. But let me make a couple of points about things that I think we do know that bear on your question. So there are at least two impacts that I want to talk about. One is that you may, for a given population, if people want to work less, it probably will lead to an increase in wages relative to profits. So an increase in labor share relative to capital share, which at this point would be a very good thing because capital share has been rising so much, labor share has been squeezed for such a long time. That more expensive labor will itself lead to more technical change. So for example, it's why we saw, I would argue, and others have, more capital intensive service sector in Europe than in the United States. So in Europe, they automated a lot of service sector things well before they were done in the United States because all labor is more expensive in Europe. In the US, you have that really low cost service sector labor, very, very cheap. And it's a big drag on innovation because, price of labor and capital is one of the things that drives firms. Yes, they have to have demand. And that's the second thing. It does seem to be the case, and I'm not sure how much is this is from the consumer side or exactly why, that in economies with higher rates of growth, aggregate growth, technological change is faster. So we don't really know why that is. It's not coming from the basic model, at least the conventional model, which is really looking much more at the relative prices of capital and labor. But so if you do slow down your economy, chances are you have slower growth. That's a more Keynesian kind of story. So it's not clear how it's going to go. Those are two dynamics which work in opposite directions. And then there are a variety of other things too. There's a sort of exogenous trend of technical change in which certain kinds of technical change lead to others because you just have a process of innovation going on. And then the question is sort of how much do you install the innovation? I would say this, there are plenty of low hours countries with really high productivity. So for example, the Netherlands, which where I lived in the 90s for a couple of years, there was a really steep, deep recession, global recession, 1980-82. And they decided to respond to that by keeping wages flat, lowering working hours. Over a period of almost about 20 years, they did that. And they kept their employment really high. they had the highest productivity, labor productivity in Europe. So Germany, for example,
Yeah.
very, very low hours country, very high productivity, particularly in manufacturing. And so I think it's there is an important point here. But what I would say is there are multiple ways to rapid productivity growth. And one of the things we see is that, a lot of high hours countries have had really poor productivity growth, like the United States.
Yeah. The third question, moving on from the feasibility to more how you would apply it in policy. So you've highlighted two ways that we can actually redistribute this productivity dividend is through one, regaining control of our consumer desires through the deconstruction of simulacrums and commodities, and introducing a progressive consumption tax. Now, how do you see the role of the education system in reforming and educating people's perceptions and ultimately getting to influence their consumer preferences?
Okay, did I ever use that word simulacrum in?
No, that comes from me.
Oh yeah, I used to teach Baudrillard. So, okay, so the education system is fascinating because, many people think that the way to solve social problems is through educating people, changing the culture, changing their taste. So, and I don't remember if these findings made it into the book or not. I think they did, but I'm not absolutely sure. The research that I did for the Overspent American was looking at that process of the social pressures to spend and sort of what is it that drives spending. And I found a really powerful mechanism, something that was sort of, had been talked about in the literature, both in economics from my wonderful former, now sadly gone colleague, Jim Dusenberry, the idea of relative income, that we care about what other people have, and that's what drives our consumer desires, to the idea of reference groups, which is a bit more in psychology and sociology, and that's sort of who do we compare ourselves to? I mean, income, Dusenberry talked about relative income, so relative to who? And what I found was, I asked people to identify their reference groups, and then I looked at their own financial status, or asked them about their own financial or economic status relative to their reference groups. And people who sort of had reference groups where people had more money than they did, spend more, save less, and the reverse for the people whose reference, who were better off than their reference groups. And then I looked at the impact of higher education, so getting a college degree in this sample that I had. And what I found was that the more education you had, holding everything else constant, the more you spent. And what I believe happens is that higher education creates a kind of upscaling process. It upscales people's aspirations, particularly because what happens with the expansion of higher education is that new groups farther down on the socioeconomic ladder get access to higher education, because it's been expanding pretty much everywhere. I mean, at different rates, but as opposed to contracting, right? So what happens is that people come into higher education and their desires are upscaled through exposure to people of higher socioeconomic status than themselves. And it's not just a process by osmosis. I mean, they're also, particularly at the more elite educational institutions, people are taught a habitus of a higher social class. So the most elite institutions in the United States, where you will have first generation college students coming and people who, are not coming from privileged classes. In addition to, the regular courses and content, they may be taught how to dress, they may be taught table manners, etc. Ways so that they can do better in the job market when they graduate and so forth. So and this is very much at the core of Pierre Bourdieu's work, which is the way in which education involves the accumulation of what he called cultural capital. And that cultural capital formed people's tastes and preferences. So education actually typically
Increases
works
it,
in
yeah.
the other direction.
Yeah.
I don't think this is something you solve by education. I think you solve it, I mean, if you want to change the consumption path of a society, and this is a really important point because you've got so many people who think that you change the consumption path of a society by trying to convince people to be more ethical, or, and you know, I have worked a lot on that sort of quote unquote ethical or conscious consumption. And there are, it's not to say that there's nothing that you can do on that front, but I really think that the labor market is the key, because mostly people spend what they get. And so altering that flow of income, if you want to get a society off a high consumption path, you do it through changing the labor market. You do it through taking productivity growth into shorter hours of work and giving people more free time. I don't see it happening in the other way. I mean, other than the state really coming in and taxing consumption and trying to, hopefully this is starting to happen with climate, where the government is going to have to put a lot of resources to an energy transition and infrastructural change and all of that. And, that's likely going to, at some point, is going to leave fewer resources for consumption. So you can also do it that way through a sort of transition program and investment program. And so you do it in wartime, right? You decide to build ships instead of consumer goods. But it won't happen through trying to change people's taste sort of exogenously, I don't think.
Mm-hmm. Well, so very related to that question is the fact that if you've been very critical of the paradigm of indiscriminate growth within mainstream economic ideology, and you've put forward the notion that wealth also comes in different formats, so not only material and financial, but also in terms of leisure time, devoting yourself to hobbies, social wealth, building connections through family and friends, and natural, being able to enjoy the natural environment around us. Now, do you believe that trying to quantify these and possibly setting these as new, perhaps not economic indicators, but political indicators and targets will set us on a path for a better balance? Or rather, could these be self-defining in the sense that viewing these forms of wealth under an indicator would seem to be commodifying exactly the aspects of life that we wish not to commodify?
Yeah, it's a really hard question. Before I answer it, I do want to make one point about sort of the first thing you said in the question, which was my critique of indiscriminate growth and mainstream ideology. I'm a little bit of a broken record on this, but I think it's really important. There's nothing in mainstream economics that is sort of inherently pro-growth. And it's not the way things are taught. I mean, it's sort of, growth is sort of taught as a, desideratum without question. We just immediately go to growth models and so forth. But leaving aside population growth and leaving aside that point we made earlier about productivity growth being faster, I mean, under high growth, that's not like a central part of a lot of the models, particularly, at a more basic level. The model says that people choose between work and in order to get income and leisure. And if you had a society in which people wanted to take all their productivity growth in the form of leisure, or maybe they decided they only wanted to consume half as much this year as they did last year, and they want to get, increase their leisure time. There's nothing in the neoclassical model that says that shouldn't happen. I mean, that would be the optimal outcome, right?
Yeah.
So somehow there was this sleight of hand in which, in the discourse of the model, in which the idea of satisfying people's preferences got morphed into growing as much as we could. And that had to do with, the conditions of the post-World War II era.
Mhm.
But it's always important to remember what the model says. Economists got amnesia about shorter hours of work. They absolutely got amnesia, mainstream economists. It just dropped out of their consciousness.
Mhm.
Okay, so anyway, off my hobby horse on that one. Onto your question, which is, should we commodify these other forms of wealth? Should we have, figure out the value of ecosystem services, for example, or the value of quote unquote natural capital? In a world where pretty much all that matters is what's marketized or monetized, this approach there's a strong attraction to an approach like this, because if all the company cares about is the bottom line, and these other forms of wealth have no impact on the bottom line, how do you get the company to care about them? And you can say the same thing for society as a whole in some way. So I understand that there's a very strong attraction, but I think the short-term gain that you would get from that actually in the end is very destructive. Because first of all, you lose any other sources of value. If we think about the sustainable systems of the past, or even the sort of small vestiges of sustainable economies or sub-economies or whatever areas that we have in the present, they worked with very strong social norms, not through monetizing everything. In fact, we don't have any example of a sustainable economy in which everything is priced. So I think we're better off constructing guardrails, smart regulations that actually do speak to incentives, right? So it's not that we can forget about incentives. Incentives are really important, both financial and other kinds of incentives. But a highly regulated world in which we figure out how to keep people following the rules. And I think we can do that. I mean, Elinor Ostrom's work shows us how important various kinds of sanctions are, and sophisticated mechanisms for keeping people, broadly within sustainable behavior patterns. I think that's going to be, in the long run, a much better way to go than just trying to put a price on everything and letting the market go. Because, I mean, for one thing, just with the kinds of distribution of economic power, of income and wealth that we have right now, you could monetize things and have a situation where you have psychopathic elites, which is what we have, just decide to burn the whole thing down. I mean, that's what we see today. It might slow them, a price on carbon might slow them down a little bit, but it wouldn't stop catastrophic outcomes.
Would you still believe that, so perhaps not incorporating its market mechanisms, but just as, say, as a government, finding indicators or trying to figure out how well society is doing in terms of the 4 indicators. So the example that comes to my head is just undertaking annual surveys and asking, how people feel in their communities, how are their friendships going, if that is relevant in policy making today, or if that is still, once again, commodifying what we do not want to.
Oh, no, absolutely. We should be doing those things. So we should be measuring. I think and I may have read your question in a wrong way. New economic indicators. Yes, absolutely. I think that the problem is when you try and collapse it all to one metric.
Yeah.
And this is what, whether it was the Stiglitz-Sen and I forget, the Sarkozy Commission, which was attempting to come up with a new, an alternative to GDP. I mean, every one of those efforts, and there have been many, many since, for decades now, all pretty much basically argue for a multi-indicator measure, because you just can't collapse. You can't collapse everything into one. And we see the harm that just having a GDP measure of marketed output has done.
Now, on the note of your research on horizontal and vertical emulation, you have previously argued that the transition from horizontal emulation to vertical emulation was driven by the media and the glorification of the nouveau riche lifestyle. So could the advent of the social media, particularly platforms like TikTok and Instagram Reels, have decoupled luxurious lifestyles and wealth from fame and influence? Just for instance, the democratization of social media could lead to your next door neighbor, for instance, being a TikTok sensation, despite belonging to the same socioeconomic status as you.
Yeah. So one point first, which is my argument about the shift from horizontal to vertical emulation, that had three components. I mean, one was the changing nature of media, but that was conventional media, television and movies. The second was the movement of married women into the labor force and into hierarchical organizations where they were exposed to people with higher incomes than they had. And I believe the third was the growth of inequality. So I just want to make sure that it's people understand I didn't think of it as solely a media-driven phenomenon, although clearly the media was important. On social media, I think actually the impact is probably different. I think it is more like what I saw happening in the beginning in the 1980s and then in the 1990s, which was that social media exposes people to others whose lifestyles at least appear more luxurious or affluent than their own, and creates desire for that. And it's partly the bias of what people put on social media. So they put their new items, they put their higher status acquisitions, they put their travel and so forth. I mean, not only, but they use it in order to position themselves in a world in which expense is still a major component of status. So I do think that it's done more to accentuate desire than sort of tamp it down. It's possible, on the other hand, I mean, there are other kinds of dynamics going on social media too. I mean, that, TikTok guy on the scooter drinking the soda, that, they're not all about consumption. And that might be the guy next door. But, the other point that I made in that book was like, you don't even know who lives next door anymore. Yeah. So you may see them online. Did you know that guy was living next door to you? Yeah.
Yeah, that is, and I do remember the TikTok that you're referring to. I believe Fleetwood Mac's.
Fleetwood Mac, yes.
Yes, that was the one playing, right?
Yes.
The song
I couldn't remember the song, but yeah, it just made people feel really good, and it didn't have anything to do with, he wasn't a glamorous guy, he wasn't an upscale guy, he was just a cool guy. And that is one nice thing, which does speak to your question, like social media is validating a whole range of kinds of people. And that's really nice. I mean, some of them are horrible, but it's sort of, rather than that sort of centralized, curated image coming out of Hollywood or Madison Avenue or whatever. Yeah.
Decentralized now. Yeah.
Exactly. A decentralized cultural production. And that's actually been going on for a long time. Even we saw the beginnings of it before social media. When I wrote the book on marketing to children, one of the things we saw was that, and one of my colleagues, Douglas Holt, has written a lot about this, and it's Malcolm Gladwell, the cool hunters, the people who went out into the neighborhoods to try and see what the trends were. So already in the 1980s, we had the phenomenon in which it wasn't those centralized gatekeepers who were driving everything, but they were going out to the neighborhoods, trying to see what was hot, what was trending, and then they'd sell it back to us.
The thought experiment question. And for you, Professor Schor, is if you could pass one bill in the US Senate, what would it be?
That's an easy one. It's HR 1, voting rights. In the United States, the right to vote is under tremendous attack from the right. It's a new Jim Crow in which people of color, particularly Black and brown people, are specifically being Republican legislatures around the country are trying to suppress their votes. And they're also putting in a lot of other shenanigans there, ways in which legislatures can overturn the votes and make decisions about elections. And if we don't do something about this, we could very well move into a period in which the minority rule, which we already have in the structure of our representative democracy, the minority rule is so accentuated that it's a much smaller minority that is able to rule the country, and that's the road down to fascism, and that's where and authoritarianism. It's where the Republican Party has been for quite a while now, and so I'd say that's number one, without which not much else can happen.